It's about history, policy, and impact. A new perspective on current affairs, bringing experience, insight, civility, and scholarship to the urgent issues of today. It's about our past, present, and future. Your host, Pulitzer Prize winning author and journalist, Douglas Blackmon. From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.
Welcome back to the Miller Center's American Forum. The foreign policy challenges that have defined so much of the presidency of Barack Obama have been in the Middle East, the fight against al-Qaeda, and now the so-called Islamic State, and Vladimir Putin and the Ukraine. In this episode, we take a break from those wearying hotspots of conflict and the endless controversy over whether U.S. policy has succeeded or failed, and turn instead to a part of the world we hear much less about, but where President Obama, according to some, has perhaps had his greatest diplomatic accomplishments: India, the world's most populous democracy. Early in his presidency, Obama made an extensive tour of India and declared that changing relations between the two countries would be a defining partnership of the century ahead. His overtures to India paralleled important changes to the U.S. approach to China at the same time. Obama made another high-profile visit to India, again in 2015, to meet with newly elected Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He announced another round of new major agreements and also triggered concerns from Pakistan, a country that has long been a military ally of the U.S. and a somewhat hostile neighbor of India. Our guests today are two expert hands on India, as well as the world's other greatest emerging market, China. Bill Antholis is the former managing director of the Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C., and recently joined us here at the Miller Center as executive director. His book, Inside Out, India and China, Local Politics Go Global, has recently been reissued in paperback. It is based on hundreds of interviews with citizens and leaders in those two countries, including one in 2012 with the now new Prime Minister. Also joining us is JEFF LEGRO, a specialist in international relations and vice provost for global affairs at the University of Virginia. He's the author of Rethinking the World, Great Power Strategies and International Order, and in 2011 was a Fulbright Nehru senior researcher in New Delhi. Thank you both for joining us.
Great to be here.
It's great to have you. So this idea is out there that India is a big bright spot for the United States and for the Obama administration right now. But most of us really don't know much about India, haven't really heard all that much about why this is such a remarkable development. So Bill, you've just reissued your book that talks a lot about this, and in your preface to your book, you acknowledge that the election of Modi actually changed the situation a bit from when you were last there for a long time. But why is this such a big deal, and is it really a success for President Obama?
Well, it's a big deal because he was elected in part saying that he wanted to get out of the wars in the Middle East and wanted to pay attention to these rising global powers that were really not just going to be shaping contemporary international relations, but would be shaping the world in the next generation. And it took him a while. Getting out of Iraq and finishing the war in Afghanistan, declaring an end to hostilities in both places was a real challenge for him. And he started to invest some of that time and energy in his first term, but I think in his second term, particularly in India, there's been a change of leadership in both places on Obama's watch, but particularly in India because of the dramatic power shift within that country. The landslide election of Narendra Modi provides an opportunity to really get some things done. We're used to political paralysis and polarization in the United States. India has suffered for that for 30 years, at least 20 years since they had a big wave of economic liberalization. And Modi now comes in with a landslide victory, which we haven't really seen in India in 3 decades, and an opportunity to get some things done. And there's a lot of optimism in both countries that can start happening now.
But the story that I think we generally understand about India and the U.S., that we've heard the most about, it's just sort of thoughtful people who follow the news, has mostly been about the outsourcing of American technology jobs and call centers. And it's been that period of time when if you called up your airline to check on your reservation, you were probably talking to somebody in India, and they might or might not know that Houston and Boston are not near each other, right, and that sort of thing, that kind of crazy period, which seems to have receded. But beyond what's different now, and what is it in terms of this particular ease between these two leaders? What are really the basic building blocks of the new relationship?
Well, that's the one thing you point to is a real important building block in the relationship. I mean, we, on the one hand, could get quite concerned about outsourcing, but there's a real strength in that, not just the fact that we have greater economic integration with India, but a lot of Indians come to the United States. Real centers of innovation in the United States have been built with Indian labor, both in India and in the United States. And while some people might see that as taking American jobs, other people see that as creating American jobs, building companies like Apple and Sun Microsystems. A lot of really, Microsoft right now is run by an Indian-born engineer. So, you know, these are really important contributions to the U.S.-Indian relationship.
We all know at some level that India was once the biggest single chunk of the British Empire long ago, and not to go too deep into the history, but give us a quick primer on India and what the relationship has been with the U.S. in the 20 years prior to what President Obama has attempted to do.
Yeah, so I mean the story goes back to the independence of India in 1947. At that time, of course, India breaks into two different countries. India and Pakistan at that time is both on the west and to the east of India, East Pakistan later becoming Bangladesh. At the beginning, of course, one would think these countries are going to get along well, that is the United States and India. A new democracy that is breaking free from the British Empire. The story isn't so dissimilar from the United States. But in fact, that isn't what happened. The two countries got off in different directions. India aligning more with the Soviet Union in the midst of this emerging Cold War. Many Indian leaders at the time are educated in Britain, are sympathetic to socialist ideas and of ways of running government. And for reasons of geography and ideology, India ends up non-aligned, but leaning towards the Soviet Union. The U.S. allies with Pakistan, setting a track of relations between the two that takes them in a way of conflict that otherwise we might not have seen.
And then meanwhile, partly as a result of that, the United States becomes more directly and explicitly associated with Pakistan, big military ally, which then has had big implications in more recent times. But so in the lead up to, I mean, as recently as just a few years ago, I think, one generally had the view that while Pakistan has also become a really problematic ally, and is it really an ally or not? Is it really our partner in what has been called the war on terror? Nonetheless, it's been a commitment of the United States that was very firm and that obstructed a more open kind of, certainly an alliance, the kind of alliance that the president's talking about now with India. But so how did the U.S. try to thread that needle 10 years ago and in most of the time since then?
Well, I think what happened is that what you saw were significant changes in India itself. It starts to open itself up in 1991 and thereafter, opening its economy, starting to tie in to world trade in a way that's more conducive to relations with the U.S. You have a setback with India's nuclear test in 1998, which leads to a very harsh reaction. But over the following years, what you see is more and more connections between India and the U.S. The U.S. recognizes it's in its interest to connect to India as well. And so you get especially a shift, I think, at the end of the Clinton administration and moving into the Bush administration, a recognition that India is an incredibly important piece of the emerging Asian architecture, and particularly with the rise of China. This is, of course, a critical factor that is, again, bringing the U.S. and India together.
Yeah, so it's almost like as China becomes more important, then by definition some other center of gravity that is somewhere nearly as substantial, which India could be, becomes this other player. But now India is also trying to make very friendly with China at the same time, right? As they're making friendly with us.
Absolutely. It's not, there of course is no alliance. Some people believe there's no strategic partnership even. It's a relationship, a tripolar relationship, if you will, in Asia, where each of the partners has an incentive to engage with the other, both for economic and military reasons. India itself, of course, has incentives to cooperate with the U.S. to deal with China, but it also has huge incentives to engage with China economically, and it has to deal with China strategically. And of course, if you look at each one of them, each of them has incentives to cooperate, but also incentives to be wary, to be hesitant, to hedge.
Yeah, and that triangle, it's quite interesting. If you think about, to mix some metaphors here, the arc of the last 20 years, how that triangle has shifted in terms of the strength of the different legs of the triangle. So the U.S.-Pakistan relationship that you talked about had a very important Chinese dimension to it. Pakistan and China are foul weather friends, they like to say. No matter how bad the weather is, they're friendly with one another. And a lot of that has to do with India and both of their mutual concern about India. And as the U.S. had a deep partnership with Pakistan, it was also deepening its trade relationship with China. And that made Indians feel doubly removed from the United States. As the economic relationship with China became more complicated, China became a major exporter to the United States. We started running trade imbalances with them. As Pakistan became a less reliable ally in the war against terror, and as this economic development between the United States and India developed, both because of India's opening and because of a software revolution with the south of India, and as India's political system moved from a socialist version of democracy to a much more free market version of democracy, suddenly the U.S.-Indian relationship started to strengthen. And then Modi gets elected. And this great promise that, one of the frustrations for American politicians and diplomats is the Indian system. If you think our politics are complicated, you should see theirs. Suddenly they became a lot simpler because maybe you could go to one person and get things done.
Rather than these region by region or state by state deals that are crazy enough in the U.S., as you say, going state by state for economic development.
And to give you a sense of how complicated that federal politics is, which is a big part of what I was going to try to understand better, we tend to think of India and China as these monoliths because they're huge and because they've been run in a very top-down way. But with economic liberalization, suddenly you have states and localities stepping forward, as we know in the United States. And to give you a sense of how complicated that is, 1.2 billion people, which is the population of India, 1.3 billion in China, that's the population of all of North and South America. So take Mexico, take Brazil, take the United States, throw in Canada and Guatemala, Costa Rica, everybody else, and then add the 27 countries in Europe and their 500 million people. And that's about 1.3 billion. So both China and India are trying to manage that geopolitical diversity. To grow their economies, they've taken the lid off of it. They've let these states and localities sort of come forward as economic and political players, but then they're trying to wrestle with it. And the promise of Narendra Modi is he was a state-level leader that made it work at the local level. And he's now coming to New Delhi, and he's saying, I can do this for the whole country. That's created a lot of optimism, but it's also created some real questions. How is he going to actually do this? How is he going to unlock this federal puzzle? Open the federal genie up and still manage it in a constructive way. And that's the challenge that we're all looking for now.
India always seemed to be this place that had such promise and fascination and a culture that was incredible, and they spoke English there. A lot of people, a tremendous number of people speak English. This place that should have been a great opportunity for the United States and was at least somewhat democratic, unlike China. But then one of those one step forward, two steps back kind of places in the world where even in the midst of great progress that would be made, even in the last few years, the big technology revolution, and a lot of people becoming very wealthy and a lot of middle class growing at a fairly remarkable pace, but at the same time, a whole lot of other people still living in absolute desperation, people in virtual state of slavery, human trafficking, all kinds of the war, caste system still holding on, even though it's now been illegal for decades.
There are ups and downs in both, but it's extraordinary what opening your markets, and to some degree opening your political system, which has happened in both places differently, does. So yes, there's enormous growth. If you look at a state like Gujarat, where Narendra Modi was, for 12 years he was the chief minister, the equivalent in the US of a governor. They grew 10% a year over 10 years. That's like Bernie Madoff Ponzi-style numbers. But it's real economic growth. And actually, unlike China, there's not a lot of state support for that growth other than basic infrastructure. Not a lot of state-owned banks giving loans. And not a huge amount of stimulus-style spending. It's mostly attracting business and making it easier for business to do business in the state and having a more or less free trade approach. It's actually really extraordinary. And that's happened in 5 or 6 other places in India, so that you've seen Indian states go from $200 a year per capita income to $1,500 to $4,000 a year per capita income, which is about what happened in the first 20 years in China. Then in the last 10 years in China, it really took off. And so the question for the next 10 years in India, is it going to take off in the way it did in China in the early 2000s?
You have to recognize there's 2 big differences between India and China. One is the centralization of government, but the other is simply the incredible cultural, linguistic diversity that takes place in India. You know, if you're traveling around that country, you're thinking, this isn't a country, it's many countries. So there are 22 official languages. 13 of those languages, 10 million or more people speak that language. Hindi is the most commonly used language. 30% of the people speak it. So you move around and to appreciate that diversity, the fact that they think of themselves as a country and can govern themselves as a country and can still make growth rates possible, that's pretty stunning.
Is there some more fundamental cultural, political metamorphosis that's happening? I mean, it is interesting that India is this place of 29 states, right? So a federal system with 29 states, as you say, a bit like the United States in certain regards. We weren't all that great at democracy at the beginning. You know, when we were a smaller number of states, we had to figure out how to do it. People had to figure out what democracy was at all. In reality, that evolution of what is democracy, you know, wasn't just worked out before the Constitution. It went on for another 100 or 150 years, arguably. And so where is India?
There's some really clear parallels between U.S. and its early history and India and its early history. Both did not want to get entangled in the world. They thought it would challenge the development of their economy and their political system, and they thought their best situation was to be removed from it, non-aligned, not get involved in great power squabbles, which explains a lot about India's non-alignment policy during the Cold War. But that policy has been challenged by interdependence. What India is recognizing is that you can't be non-aligned or at least non-engaged in a world where economic and political ties are fundamental in terms of your economic development. And so you're getting a major shift in India. We're in the midst of that right now, where India is letting go to a certain extent, a heavy and understandable belief about not wanting to be dominated by outside powers, not wanting to be too enmeshed in the other people's squabbles, to the view that, okay, we do need to be engaged, but strategically engaged and in a way that will allow us to pivot if we need to. And part of that is generational. 25%, or actually it's close to 50% of the population is under 25. They think about the world differently than their parents, uncles, aunts, and grandparents.
Who just know a lot more about it too, yeah.
And I think exactly what you said was where I was going to go. The 2 biggest domestic changes, other than formal political system changes which are happening, are the rise of materialism in India and the rise of the information economy. On the materialism side, you know, this is a country that is sort of known for its sort of spiritual dimensions, not just Hinduism, which is about 80% of the population, but you know, there are 4 world religions that have deep historic ties to India, including being founded there, right? Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism were all sort of created in India, plus 18% of the population is Muslim. St. Thomas the Doubter went to India in 40 AD or something like that, and you know, shortly after the crucifixion and the dispersal of the apostles, and he set up shop in South India. So there have been Christians in India since, you know, essentially a decade after Christ. This is a very complicated spiritual place, but cutting across the whole country is the rise of materialism, which under Gandhi's view of the country, his view of socialism, materialism was not a great thing. And it's taken them 40 or 50 years to embrace capitalism. But that is happening so rapidly, and it's cutting across caste and it's cutting across religion. So that's number 1. Number 2 is the cell phone. The cell phone is changing India dramatically. It's the computer in a pocket. People can do banking on their phones. They can find out if you're a rural farmer market prices. And they have their own versions of, well, first of all, they do use our version of Twitter, which is not the case in China, our version of Facebook and all that. But they have their own versions of things like Uber, and other geospatial devices, so that in the Indian cities you see them being technologically as advanced as we are. And that's a fascinating development. It's going to change the country.
Yeah, rapidly becoming materialists and consumers of many of the same kinds of things that people their same age are consuming in other parts of the world. And you also have in the U.S. now, partly because of that, partly because of the English language tradition, but there are probably more, not just one Indian CEO, there are a handful of Indian CEOs in the U.S. I'm certain it's far more than there are Chinese CEOs of American companies. And there is this sort of record of that while the United States does a huge amount of business with China around technology, but it's where the ideas are coming from the U.S. and the manufacturing is being done in China for economic reasons. And the great dilemma of China is how to foster a kind of creativity and ingenuity that is similar to what comes out of Silicon Valley in the U.S. It seems like in India, there's a different sort of personality that is a little bit more like the kind of approach that America seems to pull off around those things. But is that a fair observation?
I think so. You know, India is the only country in the world that the United States runs a services trade deficit with. In other words, we have all kinds of trade deficits with countries that manufacture things that we buy. But only one country in the world produces services that we buy, which is all on the software or on the call center kind of back office services. That's the bulk of it, on the one hand. On the other hand, if you count the number of Indians who come to the United States to run countries as something that adds to our side of the ledger, essentially services created here, populated by Indians, it makes up for that, and then some. So I tend to view it as an enormous contribution to America that we're not quite getting from the Chinese. Enormous number of STEM-oriented students come from China. The impulse is for them to go back for a number of reasons, including that many of them are the children of Chinese communist government officials. And for many reasons, they have to go back in both places. They want access to higher education in the United States, and we should want that. This is another big part of American soft power, is the fact that we're essentially educating the best and the brightest in those two places. On the Chinese side, they're going back, and hopefully they're changing parts of China in a way that works better for us, not just politically, but economically. In India, many of them are staying here, but that still builds a bridge. You know, many of my Indian friends have kids or grandkids here running companies. They often go back. They often come and visit. It's quite fluid.
Yeah, you know, I mean, just on that same point, there is definitely a distinct difference between the diasporas and what they're doing. And Indian Americans, I guess, I don't know what the number is now, 2.8 million are here. And you will see them as leaders in every segment of U.S. society. And you know, look at business, look at Silicon Valley, look at the entertainment industry, look at the academy, look at politics, Governor Jindal and the governor of South Carolina. So, and that kind of systematic achievement is playing a role in relations as well, because those people are still enthusiasts of the U.S.-India relation, and it's a tie that is moving back and forth in a way that I'm not sure is exactly the same with the Chinese-American population.
The joke that my family and I had when we were living in India is, versus China is, you know, you get 6 Indians around the room. It was like a Greek dinner. 6 Indians, 8 ideas. You sit around a round table in China, 6 Chinese, 1 idea, and it's the senior-most person, and you wait until they speak. And you often can't tell exactly what they've said. I mean, no, that's the sort of, China is learning to deal with disharmony, discourse, disunion. India is totally used to that. And I think ultimately that will be a strength for India. And if China figures it out, they could be extraordinarily powerful. But I think they're starting to manage conflict within their own society in a more open way, and that's going to be a rocky road at times.
Yeah, and it's interesting too the way that the sorts of things, those cultural things that we talk about in terms of immigrants in the U.S., where you see them play out here. I mean, your China story, and these are obviously broad brush descriptions and such, but that same anecdote of the 6 people around the table in an immigrant community in the United States, likely then, if it's a good idea, it's going to be financed within the group and not engaged with a regular commercial bank somehow, and because of its insularity in that particular community, maybe more likely to have a certain certainty of success in some respects, where that your Indian parallel maybe is going to send out 5 or 6 separate entrepreneurs trying to do different things, and who end up being people, not just technology folks, as you were saying, but like Indra Nooyi, who's the CEO of Pepsi now, big consumer products company globally. And then also my godchildren are Indian. Their father is went to school in the United States and is now the managing editor of CNBC. Back to Obama and India and his visit and this series of deals or near deals that were reached at the time. What is it about that configuration of things? And if you can, rattle off what some of those are. I mean, what are some of these concrete overtures that supposedly are leveraging off of these broader cultural things you've just been discussing?
Well, one of the biggest ones is a U.S.-Indian agreement on civilian nuclear cooperation. This is a really complicated agreement, but a really important one. It's complicated because for years and years, because of a treaty, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which India was not an original signatory of, but wanted to have nuclear weapons. Essentially, the nuclear powers coming out of World War II said, only us, only we can have nuclear weapons. And if you don't have a nuclear weapon, we don't want you to get one. And there was good reason for that. They didn't want all the countries in the world in an arms race to build nuclear weapons. But India and Pakistan said, hey, boy, India in particular, one point at the time they weren't quite 1 billion people, but they still had 800 or 900 million people. They said, why can't we have a nuclear weapon? And as a result, the United States would not sell civilian nuclear material, not just the uranium or whatever was going to power the reactor, but all the different things that go into building a reactor and to processing the fuel. The United States wouldn't sell that to India because India wouldn't sign up to the Non-Proliferation Treaty because they were essentially in an arms race with Pakistan.
Which was, in fact, on its way to having nuclear weapons.
Exactly. And we wouldn't provide the same stuff to Pakistan. In fact, we got into problems with China because China was providing some of those materials to Pakistan. George Bush changed all that. It was controversial, but it was actually a brilliant diplomatic move. He essentially said, look, this is the world's biggest democracy. He didn't explicitly say this, but what he was really saying is, I'm worried about China. I want to strengthen relations with India. Bill Clinton had taken us a little bit of the way there. George Bush, am going to take it further. And what I'm going to do is agree to sell civilian nuclear material to India. And Westinghouse and General Electric and other American nuclear civilian reactor manufacturers were really excited about this. This was very promising. It was a big export opportunity. But we never actually got to the point where Westinghouse, General Electric, and others would invest in nuclear reactors in India. And essentially, the American complaint was India couldn't take yes for an answer for years and years and said, we're going to ignore the Non-Proliferation Treaty and sell you this stuff. We're going to make an exception to you because you're a stable democracy. We believe you're a peace-loving democracy. And India wouldn't essentially provide liability insurance for U.S. manufacturers were there to be a nuclear reactor meltdown. In other words, if I'm Westinghouse and I help you build a reactor and I hand that reactor over to you, and you operating that reactor have a problem and that something goes wrong, like happened in Bhopal, a natural gas plant, the Indians want to be able to sue Westinghouse. And Westinghouse essentially doesn't want to do that deal. And there were all kinds of other complications in getting the law passed in India to start doing this, but it didn't happen. So one thing that President Obama and Prime Minister Modi focused on was getting that agreement done so that those investments can start happening. And there was real progress made on that. I think that the nuclear manufacturers are still trying to see if they're actually past the finish line, but there's definitely a sense of momentum that that's going to happen.
And what else is there? Because there's also a defense agreement of some sort, or intentions of that?
A big piece of it is a defense agreement. So what is driving, one of the big drivers of the nuclear deal and one of the big drivers of India's original push to go nuclear was they're dealing with the Chinese army on their borders. And the Chinese army came in 1962 and really embarrassed them. And they had to have a difficult time dealing with that size military.
And they fought 2 wars with Pakistan.
And they fought 2 wars, right, and then there. Pakistan takes off. So you have India needing to continue to deal with those challenges. Historically, it's been dependent on Soviet arms. Soviet arms, of course, are no longer the kind of leading standard in the industry. and they've got to develop their own military industry. They need modern technology, weapons, and the agreement with the U.S. is a way to do that, both to buy those capabilities from the U.S., but most importantly, to get the U.S. to help them develop their own indigenous defense industry. That's at the heart of what one of their central aims of what they want out of the U.S. relationship. And of course, the U.S. at this juncture, with a rapidly growing China, sees that as in its interest.
And so the flirtation with the Americans and the Japanese also creates fear that the Chinese will respond. And sure enough, on the day that Xi Jinping came, not just to India, but to Gujarat, Narendra Modi's home state, the Chinese forces on the border with the Indians came across where they think the border is. It's hard. It's up in the it's up in the mountains, and it's really hard to know exactly where the line of control is. They came across the border, and Modi, since then, has turned a very cold shoulder to the Chinese. He's willing to live with some Chinese tension, and he seems to have moved much closer to the United States and Japan just since October.
But what was the logic of that? That you have the new Chinese premier Xi Jinping is in India on presumably a friendly visit, but then his military crosses the border up in the Himalayas at the same time. What's the Chinese logic of that?
Well, I think there's two theories, maybe as Bill has more. One is that the military is operating autonomously on its own and asserting its own authority.
Sending a signal to their own premier. Right?
Exactly. And the second is that Xi is testing Modi. Let's see if he'll say it out in public that this is going on, or he'll want to push it under the table. And if he pushes it under the table, then maybe I'm going to be able to sway this guy.
And just the momentum that's carried forward into the India-U.S. relationship with the warm visit of Modi to the United States, which was not a done deal. Modi was kind of upset because for the years that he was chief minister in Gujarat, the United States wouldn't issue him a visa because of these race riots. So he couldn't come to the United States. And this is his first visit ever to the United States. But he gets a warm embrace from Obama. He gets 18,000 people at Madison Square Garden in a sort of rock concert kind of event. And then he welcomes Obama to India in early 2015, and they have this big bear hug at the airport in Delhi. Barack Hussein Obama and Hindu nationalist Narendra Modi. This is a dramatic breakthrough. He seems to be looking past a lot of, in the United States, there are people that fear that Obama is a Muslim, a closet Muslim. In India, though, there are those fears as well. They've had their own terrorist attacks. And the fact that Obama and Modi seem to be getting along so well is taken really seriously in India. This is a big, big shift.
And so when the president says that this could be a defining partnership of the next century, and even though it's always a sign that these days that if the current president, certainly this current president, it's a sign of that they must be actually achieving something of some positive nature for the country, generally speaking, if they then begin to be hysterically attacked on a basis that you can't quite figure out from the opposite end of the spectrum. And so even Obama has gotten, I've seen op-ed pieces about that, this isn't Obama's success, this is Modi's success. And so even as these things are happening, there's this sniping around the heels. But fundamentally, this is a change that ought to be in the benefit of everybody in the country. I mean, if this really is a defining partnership, it's not really a Democratic thing or a Republican thing. But at a time when we are very aware of what a bad job the U.S. has done in long-term thinking and foreign policy and in the assisting other countries, other societies in developing themselves from either chaos we've created or just inherent poverty and difficulties that they have, we've done a bad job of that for the last 20 or 30 years. But here's a country that we have cultural ties with, shares democracy as we do, is not aligned in a terrible way with any of our enemies in ways that can't be undone, and that one could imagine, if we're talking about a century-long sort of relationship, that this isn't just a more friendly relationship with a country that we used to be not so friendly with. It's the chance to build an alliance or to have an ally that is huge and powerful and rich and can be a military partner and shares our values and is in the right part of the world to help to make it where we don't have to be the only people who are going after the bad guys in that part of the world. I mean, is that what we're talking about? A massive kind of alliance?
I think that's the promise. The devil's in the details, right? They've got to really actually get this nuclear agreement done. Americans still fear outsourcing. Indians want more high-tech visas for their workers to come to the United States, the famous H-1B visa. India hasn't gone as far as China's gone in working together with the United States on global warming. There's a big global warming negotiation in Paris in 2015. In President Obama's last meeting with Xi Jinping, one of the breakthroughs was that they came to a common agreement on what's going to be done in Paris. I think Modi cares about climate change. He's got still very hard internal politics, because the big challenge in the United States and India is we're both democracies, right? It's ugly, it's messy, and we're complicated democracies. You can't do everything at the central level. You have to go back out to the states. One man can't make all those things happen. The devil is in the details on getting this done.
Yeah, so your account, I would say, is the plus side of the spreadsheet, but we haven't looked at the negative side of the spreadsheet, the factors that tend to cause conflict in the U.S.-India relationship. And they do have different interests. They have fundamentally different interests as countries in different places in the development cycle, in the sense that, look, if you're a developing country, you don't want to spend a lot of money on climate change right at this point. You're not clear you want to completely open your economy to uber efficient industries in other countries that are going to come in and wipe out your own industries. So on things like trade, on climate change, on other issues, they're going to have very much competing perspectives and hard competing interests. And it's true geopolitically as well. You didn't see India has benefited from, there have been downsides, but it's benefited from its relationships with the Soviet Union and Russia over the years. There was no India critique of the Crimea, silent on it. India did abstain from the resolution involving intervention in Libya. India is very opposed to interventions in other countries. India and China are much more aligned in that regard. They do not want interventions in other countries, almost for any reason, including democracy. Obviously, there's some competing interests on Iran, where India has to deal much more closely with Iran in the region and gets a lot of its oil from Iran.
They're still buying oil from Iran, when we're saying that no one should do that.
Obviously, Pakistan. Afghanistan is another tough point in the relationship.
On China, if India and China were to go to war with one another, which Indians think about all the time, we have a $500 billion trade relationship with China. We have a $100 billion trade relationship with India. And China holds a lot of our debt. And the Indians say, we go to war with China? Who are you going to back? But the other great one that was put to me, and I didn't have an answer for, in every meeting that I have with Indians, there's always a question I don't have an answer for, and this was probably the hardest. We did a preemptive strike to get Osama bin Laden. We violated Pakistani sovereignty, flew in, took him out, and got out of the country. This was somebody that perpetrated an act of terror against the United States, and the Pakistanis weren't prosecuting him. He was operating right under their nose, probably with the complicity of their military or at least their intelligence services. India's had an attack from Pakistan. If India found out the perpetrator of that attack and flew in with their own stealth helicopters and violated Pakistani sovereignty and took out those people and got out, that could precipitate a war. Would the United States back India in that context? Would we allow that attack to happen? That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, and you wonder, given the chaotic, incoherent nature of American foreign policy in many respects in the last few years, whether we have the means to arrive at an answer to that, other than just what gets decided that day by whoever happens to be the president. I mean, it reminds me as well this whole larger question of how these relationships are built and the general impatience of American foreign policy now in the American public. It made such an impression on me right after the war in Afghanistan, the first part of things, right after 9/11, and when Pakistan was in fact an incredibly important ally. Couldn't have been done really what was pulled off in terms of breaking down the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, putting Al-Qaeda on the run. But then immediately after that, the tariff exemption that Pakistan enjoyed on its textiles, and in particular men's shirts in the United States, was coming up for renewal. And Senator Jesse Helms from North Carolina sort of stood up in the Senate and said, we can't allow this exemption of the tariffs. It might take away jobs at textile mills in North Carolina, mostly textile mills that didn't exist anymore. It was just a habit. We had to stop it. And so right after this country is our ally in this incredibly important initiative to bring justice to the victims of 9/11, we turn around and on a pretty petty trade concern. I don't think I've ever worn a Pakistani-made men's shirt, but on an incredibly petty concern, we're unwilling to extend this fairly obvious kind of benefit to someone who's been our ally. And it would seem that in India we have those kinds of challenges and how you have to make the right choice a large majority of the time over a really long period of time to build the kind of relationship that the president's actually envisioning here. I mean, is that something we can pull off? Are we capable of that anymore?
Well, I mean, I have to say, I think the answer is yes. And I think big moves in foreign policy are still possible. And, Obama's being in India is part of a big move in foreign policy, right? So for Obama, the Indian relationship is very attractive because it underscores what might be his signature foreign policy initiative, and that's the pivot or rebalance to Asia, where he was trying to refocus the attention of the country away from the Middle East towards a much bigger game and challenge, and that is the challenge in Asia, the challenge of a rising and increasingly assertive China, and how one sets up a structure in Asia that both offsets Chinese, any tendency towards Chinese expansionism, but also embraces China, right? Because you don't want conflict, you don't want a war, you don't want a Cold War. You want to engage China and bring it into a system of rules and responsibilities and relationships that works for everyone. So his move was to say, let's do that. A variety of initiatives involving Japan, Australia, but India's at the other side of China, right? So you want India involved in that as well. And that initiative has set up something that from the Chinese perspective is perhaps overly containment style, but the aim and goal of the policy is certainly to embrace China as much as offset its influence in terms of domination of Asia.
We're about to, embark on our quadrennial hunger game in the United States. That is the search for the next president of the United States. And what's really fascinating about that is in the core mainstream of both political parties, there is a bipartisan embrace of seeing India in exactly the context that Jeff laid out.
But the ultimate success of it is going to depend obviously on what happens in India as well, but also China. It's going to be a complicated mix of cooperation and contention among those three countries.
Well, and you reflected this a little bit, but in terms of other challenges that exist in the situation, one is Modi himself. Now, people seem to accept more broadly now that he's an okay guy and a stable guy, but it was less than a decade ago, I think, that he was denied entry into the U.S. because of the belief that he had instigated these attacks by Hindus against Muslims that led to so many deaths. And there is this long record of progress on some front, and then particularly around these faith-driven or ethnically driven rivalries within India of really terrible things happening. And not just little flare-ups, but like that incident where huge numbers of people massacred by their neighbors, and then all of the multinational properties nearby being torched, or American companies going up in flames because of that. And the idea that Modi was once viewed as someone friendly to all of that. But you've met him. Is that the sense that you have? Is that that's not the character that he is?
Well, it's not the character that was elected prime minister in a landslide. There may be a dimension of that support. But the reason that he won with such overwhelming numbers is he ran on a platform of economic nationalism. It was about growing India and taking the economic success that he had in Gujarat and selling that to secular Indians, of which many Indians are, particularly in these kinds of contexts, and even entrepreneurial Muslims and entrepreneurial other minorities. That's what got him elected. When I was in India, he had just gone from being the second most popular politician to being the most popular politician. Sonia Gandhi's son was the most popular politician and declined, and Modi succeeded in passing him. And the reason for that was just the economic record of India, and he'd gotten so solely focused on selling the message of economic success. And his big challenge, going to what Jeff was saying is, will he succeed not just in growing the economy in terms of GDP growth, but in terms of job growth? As you mentioned, there are still so many Indians that are, they're still not a 50% urban country. nearly 2/3 of Indians live either in the countryside or off of agriculture. And that transformation, people moving to cities, people working in manufacturing, people working in high-tech services as opposed to low-tech services like sweeping and cleaning and things like that, that's a major transition. It's a generational transition. He needs to have that transition move forward and for it to lead to employment. Because like any elected political leader, his success is going to depend on not just growing the economy, but creating opportunities for people. Such that, Mr. Modi is known as a Hindu nationalist. I didn't quite realize it at the time, but about a week before I met with Modi, I was in one of these three-wheel auto rickshaws. These are the sort of tuk-tuks we call them. They call them autos there. The driver was a Muslim. And I asked him, what he thought of Modi. And many people think that Modi was responsible for race riots that killed almost 1,000 Muslims. He said, I like Modi. Modi's a man of action, and he's going to grow this economy. And at the time, I thought he was an outlier. But when Modi won his election, almost a year ago now, there were a high number of Muslim entrepreneurs that voted for him. And still, when you go back to India, you will meet them, and they will talk about how this is a new India.
Another of these challenge areas that you've already referred to in some respects has to do with climate change. I mean, that's this, and it's unusual and maybe slightly surprising that it turns out that maybe the big breakthroughs on climate change are going to occur in one-off sorts of arrangements between the U.S. and a giant polluter like China, and maybe the U.S. and a giant polluter like India. But Modi, as well, on that, somewhat surprisingly, is not asserting this position of just explicitly we should be able to pollute all that we want for as long as we want until we've caught up. In fact, he's an advocate of doing something about climate change. But where does that factor into the whole equation?
One of the things that I wanted to talk to Modi about was this issue, because I had heard about and seen that he was thinking about being proactive. And it was one of the reasons that I wanted to write the book. Having worked on the Kyoto negotiations when I was at the White House, I was very aware of our own federal politics, that senators from West Virginia, even if they were Democrats, didn't want to do stuff on climate change. Yet you had Republican governors in places like New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, California, who passed climate change legislation. And so I wanted to know what these state and local leaders thought about these issues. And I had come across not just Modi's economic success, but that he had been interested in the issue. So I walk in to meet with Modi, and I've got my set of questions for him. And he hands me a copy of his book called Convenient Action. And it's about his effort in Gujarat to address climate change. And it was titled as a direct response to Al Gore's. Al Gore, you've got your inconvenient truth. I've made it convenient to act on these issues. The challenge in India is they are so far behind in terms, first of all, India is the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases. At 1.2 billion people, per capita, that is not a lot of greenhouse gases per person. But if you add them all up, they're now behind the United States. China's first, the United States is second, India's third. As India continues to grow, it's going to have to put more power online, and a lot of that's going to be coal. And he knows that, and everybody knows that, and everybody knows that coal is the most likely place that India can get cheap electricity. And so what he has been trying to do, and what he said he wants to do, is have more solar, more wind, more hydro, but that coal is going to be part of the question. And then the question is, how much coal? Can nuclear come on? If it's going to be all of those things plus coal, what kind of coal? Not just what kind of physical coal are you burning, but how are you burning it? He's got a big, complicated thing because a lot of this is done at the state level where he had his own successes. So he's very committed to the issue. The big challenge in the international negotiations, we're going to be hearing a lot about India in the next year, is that, as Jeff was saying, India is sort of a sovereignty hawk. They don't like being told by international bodies like the UN what they can and can't do. That's quite familiar to the United States. We've heard about blue helmets and black helicopters of the UN coming in and telling us that, sort of cows can't emit methane because it's a greenhouse gas. What, I'm a farmer in, Wisconsin. You're going to tell me that my cow can't produce methane? That's kind of tough to control that. What am I supposed to do? India has a lot of cows. And this is a big issue for them. All of this is a big issue for them. And so he, on the one hand, wants to do things because I think he sees both the domestic impacts of climate change, the domestic impacts of regular air pollution. I think he understands the global concerns. He's inspired by religion on this. but he also doesn't want to be constrained internationally. He doesn't want to have his economic growth constrained. So we'll see out how much he'll live up to his convenient action when it comes to the whole country.
Though this is one of these areas where the bipartisan, polarized nature of politics in the U.S., and particularly around this question, could come into play. That to the degree that if this new relationship with India, a growing relationship with India, has at its core some sort of a shared sensibility around climate change, then there are going to be a lot of people in the U.S. and one part of the political spectrum who are going to challenge that. And that seems like the sort of thing that, whatever one's view is on climate change, that's sort of back to our dysfunctional approach to sort of fumbling the ball in a foreign policy opportunity out of a short-term desire for political points to score back in the U.S. I mean, is there a risk of that?
Well, I mean, I think so. I think one of the reasons, as you pointed out before, that President Obama reached out to China, why he's reaching out to India, the United States, the European Union, which negotiates as one, China and India, half the world's population, 60% of the world's economy. We've got the G194 in the UN trying to negotiate these big, complicated agreements. One of the big concerns in the United States is if we act and China and India don't act, it's going to be a lot cheaper for them to do their economic activity. We're going to make it more expensive for us. We won't be able to compete with them. So I think if the United States can do bilateral deals with, those are the four biggest emitters, if we can do bilateral deals with China, with India, and with Europe, it not only makes the global negotiation easier, it makes the domestic negotiation easier. We can then go back and say our main economic competitors are also acting. There's a quid pro quo in this conversation, and the one place it becomes more complicated is that we've got 50 governors. Each of them is responsible for an EPA. They got 30 provinces in China, 28 states and 29 states in India, 27 states in the EU, and they can't figure out how to manage their finances, let alone the national, subnational regulation of these things is almost as important as the international diplomacy.
So let me ask you a completely different kind of question, sort of a philosophical one, as two people who set out to become experts, as you have, on the kinds of things that you've done. It is interesting to be talking about India as long as we have been here, and it's a white guy from America, and a white guy from America, and a Greek American guy, the three of us talking about this, trying to get to it. One of the things I observed over time as a journalist was that foreign correspondence, there was a line they could never really cross. You could try really hard, you could master the language, you could study a place really, really closely, but in the end, the foreign correspondent writing about the politics of this other country that's not their home society, invariably is still writing about a foreign place, still just never quite gets it. Does it, when you're trying to do that as sort of scholars of foreign policy and scholars of international relationships, do you have the same anxiety in the back of your head of that no matter how hard I study this place, am I actually getting it?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, right at this moment, I'm having that feeling. But I've spent a year living in China and 6 months living in India. There's a saying, I think it was Edgar Snowden, in China, that you can write about China after being there 2 weeks and after being there 20 years, but not in between. And it speaks to the difficulty of understanding these places. Inherently, neither Bill or I or India are China experts. We look at them in a comparative frame. So you're touching on those places, but you will never fully understand them unless you really committed yourself to the deep language and cultural understanding that requires long periods of time being there. That said, we should all be reaching out to try to understand those cultures. And even from short stays there, even from short immersions in their authors, their literature, their movies, their TV, you will understand better how they think about the world, and that is really invaluable.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Jeff said. 1.3 billion people, 1.2 billion, try to generalize about that. My wife liked to joke about, we took our two young daughters with us on this trip, and she liked to joke about how sort of much of a folly this exercise was. The audacity of a dope to take this family of four and travel we lived in 8 different places in 5 months. Somebody told us in India, any declarative statement that you can say about India that is true, the exact opposite is also true. And that applies to China as well. I think China has almost an artificial sense of uniformity and harmony. And for me, that was probably the most rewarding part of it. Was many times the experts that Jeff talks about that really know these countries well don't try to make it plain and simple for an audience, because the contours and the complexities are so, challenging. And it takes an idiot to take a step back and say, this is basically how these places work. So I was happy to embrace that, the audacity of a dope challenge that my wife put to me.
Well, it's a fascinating conversation. It's wonderful that there are scholars like you who are trying to figure these things out. Let's hope that there is a defining new partnership for the century that's coming now. Big countries, big issues. Thank you both for being here. Jeff LeGros and Bill Antholis. His book is Inside Out, India and China. To learn more about this book and these guests, to send us a comment, to watch the program, or download a podcast of this and other episodes, visit us at millercenter.org, American Forum. I'm Doug Blackmon. See you next time.